world leaders in condemning Russia's invasion. He has just given another statement.
Liebe Mitbürgerinnen und Mitbürger,
dear fellow citizens,
heute ist ein furchtbarer
today
Tag für
is
die
an awful
Ukraine
day for Ukraine,
und ein düsterer Tag für Europa.
and it's a gloomy day for Europe. We are all concerned about the peace.
Ich kann mir gut vorstellen, welche Fragen
I can't
Sie sich
imagine the
heute Abend
questions you may ask yourself
Mir geht es gar
tonight.
nicht anders.
I feel pretty much the
Die
same.
Lage ist
The
sehr
situation is very serious.
Gerade erleben wir den Beginn eines Krieges,
We've just seen the
wie wir in
beginning of
Europa
a
so seit mehr als
war
75 Jahren
that
nicht
we haven't witnessed in Europe for the last 25
Russlands
years.
Präsident Putin hat die Entscheidung
Russia's
getroffen, die
President
Ukraine
Putin has
militärisch
decided to
anzugreifen.
attack
Das ist ein
the
Überfall
Ukraine
auf ein
in military
unabhängiges,
terms. That's an
souveränes
attack
Land.
on an independent,
Das
sovereign
durch
country.
nichts und durch niemanden zu
This
rechtfertigen.
cannot be justified
Das ist der Versuch,
by anything
Grenzen
and by
innerhalb
nobody.
Europas
It's an
gewaltsam zu
attempt
verschieben,
at shifting
ja vielleicht ein
borders
ganzes
with
Land von
violent
der
means in
Weltkarte
Europe,
zu tilgen.
maybe even to eradicate a whole
Voller
country from the map of the world.
Mit den Grundprinzipien
Deliberately,
der Charta der
Putin
Vereinten Nationen und mit der europäischen
violates the principles of the UN Charter and the
gefährdet das Leben
European
unzähliger Bürgerinnen und
peace
Bürger
order.
der Ukraine,
He endangers the
den
life of
Brudervolk
countless people in the Ukraine, a sister nation. All that happens not far away from us here in Europe. Just 2 flight hours from Berlin. Their families sitting in bomb shelters. Women, men and children are afraid of their lives. Ukrainians take to the arms to defend their home country against an invading army. In those difficult hours, we think of the courageous people in the Ukraine. In a phone call, I told President Zelensky today, the Ukrainian people and its freely elected government have our full solidarity. This violation of the sovereignty of Ukraine by Russia, that's something we are not going to accept. The attack on Ukraine is an attempt by Putin to turn back time, but there is no way going back to the time of the 19th century when the big powers decided and the small powers had no say. There's no way back to the times of the Cold War when the superpowers divided the world amongst themselves, and there is no way back to the times before 1989. At that time, the citizens of Central and Eastern Europe fought for their freedom and democracy. They did that in our country, they did that in the Ukraine, and that is why we have always warned Putin not to wage war against Ukraine. A week ago, I personally talked to him in the Kremlin over several hours, and I told him clearly this war would be a bad mistake. It would also endanger the future of his own country. It would also be a damage to his own nation. President Putin ignored all the warnings. He ignored all attempts to find a diplomatic solution. He alone, it wasn't the Russian people who decided for that war. He alone bears full responsibility for that. That war is Putin's war. Once again, I call upon President Putin, stop fighting, stop military action, withdraw Russian troops from the Ukraine, take back the recognition of Luhansk and Donetsk. We have always tried to find dialogue. We have always tried to find a way to talk to Moscow. We had hope, but we were not naive. And that is why, in parallel to that, we prepared for this case. With our allies, with our partners in the European Union and in NATO and in the G7, we have agreed on a whole package of economic sanctions. Our goal is to show to the Russian government that they will pay a high price for this aggression. Right after Donetsk and Luhansk were recognized by Russia, we imposed the first sanctions, and we have suspended the certification of Nord Stream 2, the gas pipeline. Given the current attack on Ukraine, we will place more and profound sanctions that will hit the Russian economy very hard. We, at the same time, must make sure that this conflict doesn't spill over to other countries of Europe. I am in agreement with our American and European partners that we want to do everything we can to prevent such a situation. Putin shouldn't underestimate the NATO resolution to defend ourselves. This goes also for our NATO partners in the Baltic states, in Romania, Bulgaria and everywhere. Germany and its allies know how to defend themselves. Dear fellow citizens, we are resolved and we act together. This is our strength as free democracies. Putin is not going to win. The citizens in the Ukraine want democracy, they want freedom. And Europe's future will be a future in freedom and in peace. We are going to make sure this happens together with our friends and partners.
Well, that was Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz with a national address addressing the big story of the day that we're covering around the clock here on Deutsche Welle, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Listening to that speech is DW's chief political editor, Michaela Kufner, who's with us now. Welcome, Michaela. So here we have a Chancellor only a few months into his new job, and then this. Pick out some of the highlights of that speech for us, would you please?
Yeah, he's in office for less than 80 days. It took Angela Merkel almost 1.5 decades to find a crisis, the pandemic, to address the nations. For Olaf Scholz, he certainly doesn't get that 100-day grace period and has to talk about a war. He says this is Vladimir Putin's war. He vows that Putin will not win. He also promises a future for Europe in peace and freedom, together with friends and allies. These are historic days. These are actually historic hours where Olaf Scholz has to stand before the nation and say that Vladimir Putin basically rejected the extended arm of diplomatic talks and negotiations time and time again. Olaf Scholz himself was in Moscow last week on Tuesday. I was with him on that flight. I saw him essentially try everything, not mention the Nord Stream 2 pipeline as an entry ticket for talks with Vladimir Putin, only to learn today that Vladimir Putin quite clearly already had made up his mind to wage war, to invade Ukraine, once again, one has to say, and now this fully fledged war, and we're already right in the middle of the war over the narrative on this, because it's quite striking that the West is responding, while Vladimir Putin too claims that he himself has to respond to what he perceives to be a threat by the West, by NATO.
Now, Germany's economy minister has said that new Western sanctions will hit Russia badly. Perhaps you could talk us through what's on the table.
Yes, well, we're still to learn from the EU what exactly that next step of punitive sanctions, as it's being put, not just by Olaf Scholz, will be. We expect Russia essentially to be cut off from a lot of the cash flow, of international cash flow there. But we also heard from Germany's trade minister earlier today saying that these sanctions will also hit some German industries. This could be high-tech industries. We heard earlier from Commission President Ursula von der Leyen that the intention is to prevent the progress, the development of Russia in the future, that by clinging to the past, it is losing its prospects for a more prosperous future there. So we're still to learn the details, but this is going to hurt not just Russia, particularly badly Germany, a key trading partner. Here also, the German trade minister preparing the ground to explain to Germans why they will feel in their pockets the fact that Vladimir Putin has decided to attack Ukraine.
Yeah, you bring me to my next point, because we're at a situation where the imposition of these sanctions is going to hit the German economy, as you say, Russia, a major trading partner. But also when it comes to power, where Europe already seeing major increases in power prices, and that tap from Russia, especially if those sanctions completely remove that, that's going to be cut off, and up go the prices.
And that's also why the German trade minister was keen to stress that energy security was there. That's also the message we heard out of Brussels earlier. But just take a look at the markets. The oil prices are already rising as we speak. With Germany being so highly dependent, with 40% of gas supplies coming from Russia, 35% of oil supplies, yes, there is a great dependency, which Germany is at pains to get rid of by mandating in the future those energy providers, the storage facilities, to keep more storage. But that's all talk for the future. And yes, we have the promise that it will be enough, that people won't have to turn off their heating, but people will feel this in their pockets. And that is the explaining German, European countries have to do to their citizens. But also the whole military aspect is now suddenly something in the center of German public debate. Germany is not used to this, and Germany is not used to talking about its own security and debating that.
All right. Well, we're in a new world this morning. Michaela Kufner, Chief Political Editor, thank you. So what are people saying on the streets of Moscow? Well, let's hear from some of them. And as you would imagine, there were mixed reactions.
I wouldn't want a full-scale war in Europe or in the world. I hope that the problem will be solved soon and there will be peace again.
No one knows what's going to happen with the currency, with our economy, and it's not clear if we're able to survive the crisis like in 2014, or our situation will only get worse.
I can't say that this situation makes me happy, rather extremely concerned. Otherwise, Ukrainian and Russian actions seem logical from both perspectives. So it doesn't allow you to choose who's right or wrong. For me, it's a brotherly country and a brotherly people.
If Putin thinks it's necessary, then it should be done this way in terms of protection of civilians. I know some people in Donetsk and Luhansk, and I know how they used to live. These people want to help them.
Let's have a look at what else is going on in Moscow, then, with journalist Natalie Smolentsova. Welcome to DW, Natalie. Is this making the news there in Moscow today?
Yes, absolutely. In all the major TV channels and news publications, this is the only topic people are talking about. Importantly, how are the Russian media reporting about this topic? Because the narrative that is being presented here drastically differs from the narrative we are talking about at DW News, for example. And in the main Russian channels, this is portrayed not as war or invasion or occupation even. It is portrayed as the military operation with the goal of freeing the Ukraine from its current regime and protecting the people there.
And the people buying that, is that the message that Russians are taking from this?
Well, this message didn't come in only today. There have been a lot of preparation for this message and for this moment. There have been ongoing propaganda campaign on Russian state TV for months and for days now. That's why a lot of people in Russia are confused right now what to feel and how to feel about this. And we've seen in the report from the streets of Moscow that people are very divided. There haven't been a strong support for recognizing of so-called Luhansk and Donetsk People Republic. Only about 45% of Russian population, according to independent Levada Center poll, are supporting this decision of Putin. And we don't know yet how many people are supporting this invasion. But people are in shock, and they are obviously not ready, have not been ready to see what's happening now.
Right. So whatever the story is that President Putin is giving them, this does not sound like the Russian people are ready to lose their sons and their husbands in a war over Ukraine.
Yes, a lot of people are very scared and they don't know what to think. And out of this feeling, many people are going out to the streets to protest. And they're saying they don't even hope that something will change because they don't know how can they affect the decisions in Kremlin. But many people on the streets have been telling my colleagues that they cannot just not go out. They don't know what else to do. And there have been protests in Russian cities all across Russia. Right now in Moscow, there are several 100 people on the streets. It's really hard to estimate how many because they've been detained all the time. And right now, according to the last information, around 600 people have been detained in these protests all over Russia.
Right. And these are protests calling for what?
So the protesters are calling for no war. They don't have any other political demands yet. They are not shouting, even sometimes calling, sometimes shouting, sometimes just bringing flowers to the protests. They don't even, some have something written on their banners, like no war in Ukraine or just no war. Some are just there because they are afraid of speaking up publicly because the price of this can be very expensive.
Right, this is one of the things that has most impressed me about what you said there, that the idea that hundreds of people would take to the streets in a country where even one person carrying a placard can be arrested. So clearly they feel very strongly about this.
Yes, exactly. A lot of people are feeling very strongly about it because they have been living in this situation for a long time. There is the conflict, how it's portrayed here, have been there since 2014, and I think, or I have a feeling that no one expected this to escalate so quickly until that extent. A lot of people on social media express their grievances, their fears, their shock, their sadness in this moment, and a lot of also prominent Russians, not politicians, but actresses and journalists, and even TV presenters from the state TV are saying on their social media that they are feeling really strongly about it. They're ashamed and they don't support this decision and they don't support the war.
Thank you so much for joining us and painting us that picture of life in Moscow at the moment, Natalie. Natalie Smolentseva, journalist. Thank you. Well, my colleague Anya Scharneforth has had the opportunity to speak to Roderich Kiesewetter. He's a member of the German Parliament for the opposition Christian Democrats and sits on the Parliamentary Foreign Affairs Committee.
The scenario that everyone feared has now happened. What was your response? What were your thoughts when you heard the news?
Well, I wasn't surprised. I only was surprised by the effectiveness and speed he did this. Because in June last year already, he announced to integrate, not to reintegrate, Ukraine to Russia and has denied the right of existence of Ukraine. So all the effort from the Western side since 2008 to avoid the membership of Ukraine in NATO or to arm, since 2014, to arm the Ukraine, were taken from Putin as a sign of weakness, and therefore we should read very carefully what he has uttered and edited the last months and years.
Germany's been very reluctant to give military support to Ukraine. Is that something that should now and will now change?
Well, I'm in a minority. I have asked for a selective support with weapons, air defense, for example, measures to protect borders, anti-tank missiles, and others, but also jammers against IT infrastructure and signal. Nevertheless, I believe that our position will not change. I believe that we will or might support others to export weapons. But our armed forces are so weak, not able to export or to bring over the borders any of the weapon systems. So we also should reassure ourselves that if we want to have a deterrent force, then we must invest much more into our armed forces than in the past.
Do you think further sanctions will have any effect?
No, they will not have any effect on his plan to occupy Ukraine, to integrate Ukraine, and probably will have no effect on incubating Belarus into Russia, and will not have any effect to destroy Transnistria or to destroy the right of existence of Moldavia. So we are at the beginning of a huge change of the landscape, of the map of Eastern Europe.
So what can Europe, what can Germany specifically do to try and avoid that scenario?
We will not avoid it because nobody is willing to have war. But what we could do is to affect the lines of communication of Putin and to destroy the reliability of his population. So this population is suffering from spare goods, is suffering from a weak infrastructure, is suffering from participation. And we see also your broadcast is not available to be present in Russia any longer. But I believe in the power of democracy, and Putin is in fear of democracy and freedom. What we should expect is that we need patience. We need an enduring effort for the next years. And Putin does not believe that we have the power to be patient.
Anja Scharnefort talking to Roderich Kiesewetter. You're watching DW News live from Berlin. Let me recap our top story, our only story of the day. Russia has launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, with attacks being carried out by air and land forces across the country. Kiev says dozens have been killed and many injured in an assault that NATO says amounts to a cold-blooded invasion. Western leaders say they will impose crippling sanctions as thousands of Ukrainians scramble to leave the biggest cities. Let's catch you up with your business news then. Hi, Christine. What have you got for us?
Right. Well, we have a update coming up for you just in a moment here. So the knock-on effect of Russia's invasion is being felt around the world. U.S. stocks declined at the market open after European markets closed in the red, and with some indices losing more than 5%. Asian markets dropped by around 3%. Safe havens are in high demand, with the price of gold up by almost 2%, its highest level in more than a year. Other news in the economic fallout of Russia's invasion of Ukraine include the price of Brent crude, which has topped $100 a barrel for the first time in 7 years. The Russian ruble has fallen to a new low against the U.S. dollar. And meanwhile, Germany says it will boost its cyber attack defense amid the invasion in Ukraine. And Ukraine has closed its airspace to civilian flights due to the high safety risk. And the effects of Russia's invasion of Ukraine are being felt at home as well, of course. Let's take a closer look at exactly how markets reacted.
Russian markets collapsed so swiftly Thursday that trading had to be halted. Markets are back up and running now, but the mood is still somber. Russia's attack on Ukraine has spooked investors all around the world. We are seeing the classic patterns of the markets. Gold goes up, government bonds go up, oil, gas is going up even more, and what goes down are the equity markets, with the uncertainty of what happens next. The opinion is still that there will not be a large-scale military conflict involving NATO. Oil prices have already jumped above $100 a barrel, the highest level since 2014. That's when Russia annexed Crimea. How much further crude will rise will depend on if Russia's energy exports are hit by Western sanctions.
I think for prices actually to increase, it's not only the actual fact happening, but really the expectation that it might happen might be enough to actually increase the oil price on the global market. I mean, Russia is the second biggest exporter of oil.
Traders are hanging on every move from the Kremlin now. How international markets trade in the coming days will depend on the course of war in Ukraine and the effects of Western sanctions.
Well, Russians are worried about their savings as the ruble loses value against the dollar. The currency could fall even further if Russia is excluded from the global payments SWIFT system.
People across Russia are lining up to withdraw their savings and exchange them for US dollars or euros. That's after the value of the Russian ruble plunged to a record low. Banks in Moscow are charging 100 rubles for $1 US. A week ago, it cost only 75 rubles. Russia's central bank has been intervening in the currency market to try and stabilize the ruble, while also providing support to financial institutions. No one knows what's going to happen with the currency, with our economy, and it's not clear if we're able to survive the crisis like in 2014, or our situation will only get worse. 2014 was when Russia annexed Crimea and was hit by a slew of sanctions from the West. This time, financial penalties could hit harder. Some want Russia excluded from the global payment system, SWIFT. SWIFT is how most Russian banks send money in and out of the country. Without it, Russia's trade with the world would grind to a halt.
The most severe sanctions, such as cutting Russia off from the global SWIFT payment system or excluding Russian banks from the global financial market, would endanger Russia's energy exports to Europe and also other exports where Russia is a significant supplier, such as industrial materials like nickel, copper, etc.
So far, the West has decided not to pull that lever. Blocking Russian gas or raw materials deliveries could ricochet back on Western powers through higher prices and bottlenecks.
The Kremlin may be banking on some resistance from European governments to go that far, because they would be also impacted if the energy exports were disrupted.
But there is no certainty that the Kremlin's bet will pay off. In any case, the cost of war will be high for Moscow. Economists assume that the war will drive the country into a deep recession and worsen the standard of living for all Russians.
And that's all from this special business update on how Russia's unfolding invasion of Ukraine is affecting financial markets. Now back to Phil Gale with the latest news developments.
Thank you so much for that. And yes, of course, this is the big story of the day, the only one we're covering at the moment, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. DW correspondent Fanny Fashar is in Kiev and sent us this.
Just before, I've been hearing once again sirens blaring. We have heard that quite often today. In fact, for the very first time, shortly after the first explosion hit here around 4 a.m. or shortly after Vladimir Putin declared, quote, a military operation against Ukraine. Now, that military operation actually turns into a full-scale invasion. Several rockets had hit various cities. An invasion by land, by air, by sea. That is what is happening right now in Ukraine. And people here in Kyiv, the ones who are staying, are hoping that maybe what we have experienced this morning, the explosions, the shelling, that maybe this is it. But if you ask me, there have been so many things happening over the course of the past days that nobody thought is likely and turned out to be realpolitik. For example, the recognition of the two self-proclaimed states in the Donbas region, Luhansk and Donetsk, that have been basically taken as declared as, as an independent region, and also Vladimir Putin saying that basically Ukraine doesn't have the right to exist as a state. So that clearly signals that unfortunately, more likely, more is to come, even though at this point things seem to be calm. Behind me, we have seen a lot of Ukrainian security forces. We cannot independently verify actually what those shellings or what those explosions have hit, but there are reports that the military airport just 50 kilometers from here was also attacked, as well as a building which is supposedly the military intelligence headquarters.
Well, that's DW correspondent Fanny Fashar in Kiev. Let's find out more about the EU reaction then with DW's Brussels bureau chief, Alexandra von Naumann. Welcome, Alexandra. So let's talk about what EU leaders have been saying today.
Well, we expect the European leaders to arrive here shortly, and they are coming together to discuss further measures against Russia, sanctions, but so far many leaders expressed their feelings also, and we expect this actually to be a quite emotional summit also, according to EU officials that we have been speaking with. The European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen spoke of dark hours in Europe. She condemned Russia's unprecedented and unjust justified attack on Ukraine. Those two words were heard here repeatedly today. The French President Emmanuel Macron, for instance, said that this is a turning point in history of Europe, and the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who was also speaking of a dark hour in Europe, assessed that the Russian President Vladimir Putin is trying to turn back time in Europe.
Right, and as they meet to talk about sanctions, if I'm right, this will be the third set of sanctions. The EU has had sanctions against Russia for months, even years. They agreed another set, and then this happened. If you look at the track record, the use of sanctions doesn't look particularly effective. What is this latest set likely to look like?
Well, you're right that it seems that Vladimir Putin doesn't care at all about sanctions and consequences. But the European leaders had made it clear before that they are determined to impose massive and severe sanctions against Russia, sanctions that will erode Russia's industrial base, according to European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. What is on the table are sanctions against whole sectors of Russia's economy, the transport sector, financial market. Ursula von der Leyen stressed that companies will not be able to borrow money on international markets, and there is more to come.
All right, thank you for that. DW's Brussels Bureau Chief Alexandra von Naumann. You're watching DW. Stay tuned for our continuing coverage of Russia's war against Ukraine.